This is Pastor Don Long, and here we are on the Jewish Roots broadcast. Last week and again this week, probably next week as well, we're going to feature the whole broadcast around the news in the Middle East. It seems that that is the focus of the world, what's going on in the Middle East. When you step back and look at it, it is so amazing that all the world focuses on a speck of land no bigger than New Jersey, as if somehow or other the peace of the whole Middle East resolves around what the Israelis are going to do. There was a group of academic people in the United States who recently voted to boycott Israeli universities. I find that quite amazing that academic freedom somehow gets hampered because of people's political views. But more than that, that of all the people that you would say, well, we're not going to associate with you because we don't like how you're treating people, that they would pick Israel when most of the Middle East nations are very discriminatory against women, against minorities, certainly against Christians and Jews, but they choose Israel. It seems to be almost a phenomena that's beyond imagination, that so many people in the world would find themselves stirred up about Israel. What is it about Israel? What is it about the Jews? You know, one of my friends in Israel years ago was having a conversation with me and said that very same thing. What is it about us Jews that the world hates us? And I said, stop and think about it. It is a supernatural hatred. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason why all the focus should be on Israel. There's no thing that makes common sense as to why so many resolutions at the United Nations should be against Israel. I mean, there are human right abuses that have been well documented in other places in the world, and we hear nothing from the United Nations. There have been genocides going on in African nations, and we hear very little, if anything, out of the United Nations. But Israel is constantly being accused of this and that and all manner of evil, most of which is based on false premises, false understanding of history, and a false claim of statehood by the Palestinians, who, by the way, before 1967, never claimed that that's who they were or they wanted a nation. And so it is that the biggest threat, it seems, existentially to Israel is now in Iran, as Iran is attempting to gain nuclear weapons and is very clear about what they're going to do with those nuclear weapons. Amazing to me that it seems that the world doesn't learn too much from history. When your enemy threatens to annihilate you, one should expect that to be a truth. It's not just mere rhetoric. When we look at Israel, in fact, as her neighbors historically have mounted political words and come against Israel, the truth was they intended to do that. It was only by the supernatural intervention of God and the great heroism of the Israeli military that Israel even continues to exist today. Amazing to me that it was the United Nations that granted Israel's existence. It was the United Nations that set apart that land. It was the League of Nations before that in fact set up the British mandate to be a homeland for the Jews. So the nations of the world were in agreement that all of that area was to be a homeland for the Jews. It was Britain that unilaterally took 3/4 of that land and separated it out and created the nation of Jordan. And by the way, when Britain did that, they decreed that no Jews were allowed to go in that area. I can't imagine anybody saying we're in favor of openness and liberal ideas, and yet you say you're going to create a place or a nation where one ethnic group is forbidden to live. But we don't need to go back to the 1940s for that. We can look at it today. The Palestinians are claiming that they want to have a nation. Many people think, yes, they need to have a nation. But that nation has already declared that it will be Judenrein. It will be Jewish-free. Jews will not be allowed to live there. Since when do the nations of the world agree to set up a nation when an ethnic group is forbidden to live there? Can you imagine if Israel on its hand said, okay, you have your land with no Jews, we're going to have our land with no Muslims. All Arab Muslims must leave Israel right now. The world would be up in arms at the mere suggestion of it. And yet that is exactly what's going on throughout the Middle East when it comes to Jews and, yes, even Christians. The battle in Egypt right now is over whether Christians are going to be allowed to survive in Egypt. Churches are being burned down by Muslim Brotherhood mobs, and yet we hear nothing from our State Department condemning that. The nations of the world and the United Nations make no move whatsoever. Where do you go to the city of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus Christ, a very key place for a lot of Christianity? You would find that the Christian population of Bethlehem has been decimated. Where it used to be over half of the population was Christian, now it's just barely percentage points. Why? Because of persecution, because of being driven out. The point is that there's only one nation in the Middle East that respects the religious liberty of all religions, and that is Israel. None of the surrounding Middle East nations, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, they do not respect the rights of all religions like Israel does. And yet Israel is the one that comes under condemnation. If you happen to believe that gay people have rights, well, they have rights in Israel. By the way, they have no rights in Jordan. They have no rights in Saudi Arabia. Gay people, if they're found out in those nations, will be executed. And yet you don't find the United Nations attacking those nations that have policies against minorities, but they come against Israel that supports them. It is a supernatural. It's not a natural phenomenon. You cannot say, well, it has a rational explanation. When academics, professors of educational institutions take stands that are decidedly anti-Semitic, you say, what is going on? We are supposedly at the most liberal point in American history. The progressives seem to have captured every move forward. The government seems to be opening all doors. And yet, why is it in our academic institutions there is very little, if anything, being said about radical Islam, about terrorism, about the way women are treated in Islamic societies, about honor killings, and yet these same academics will attack Israel? It is, as I've said, supernatural. There is no natural explanation. And so, as I told my friend in Israel, there's only one explanation. To me, the persecution, the objection, the overwhelming coming against Israel is a direct reflection on the truth that Israel is God's people, God's chosen people, God's chosen nation. That's what the Bible says. And therefore, behind the move against Israel is an anti-God movement. If the Jews have a right to exist and to advance, if Israel has a right to be there and advance, then maybe there's something to Israel's God, to Israel's Torah. And if that's so, then maybe we are accountable to God. And a culture or cultures that do not want to be accountable to God and His Word, therefore have inside of them a drive against God's people. It's amazing if you look at the Nobel prizes in chemistry and medicine, physics, overwhelmingly they are awarded to Jewish people. God said to Abraham, I will bless you, and I will cause you to be a blessing to the peoples. Well, that is carried out. There is a phenomena of intellectual advancement among the Jewish people, and contributions to the prosperity of humanity are overwhelmingly coming out of the Jewish community. The very community that the Arabs would like to see obliterated, the very community that the radicals would like to see destroyed, is the community that contributes the most to humanity. If you were to simply look in the scientific and technological realm, you would find that Israel far surpasses any advancement anywhere other than the United States and Silicon Valley. But if you take it on a per capita basis, remember, Israel's only the size of New Jersey. That would be like saying all of the United States has this amount of intellectual property, and second is this tiny nation of Israel. Something is going on. The phenomena of blessings, the phenomena of scientific advancement, the phenomena of entrepreneurial expertise far outweighs its population in Israel, and yet that is the very nation that many in the world would like to see obliterated. Signs of the end times. You know, as a Christian who believes in the Bible, I believe that we are in the crucial time in earth history. All the signs are pointing to the coming of the Antichrist, as the Bible refers to him, coming to the end of time. What does all that mean? Well, it simply means that God gave a lease to Adam and Eve for planet Earth. There is an earth lease under which man has free will to do whatever man wants to do with the gift of God. But it's not like I bought a car, it's like I leased the car. As long as I'm paying the lease, and for the 3 years of my lease, I get to drive the car, but it's never my car. It is the dealer's car, but I get to use it. I get to take it places. I treat it as if it's mine, but we're coming to the end of a car lease, and now it goes back to the dealer. Well, Earth is under a lease. Biblically, there's a 6,000-year lease to mankind, and that is about to run over. All the prophecy teachers that you can listen to agree upon one common theme. We are in the last of the last days. And the Bible gives a picture of what's going to happen. That the nations of the world during this time are going to gather against Israel. My goodness, isn't that what we're talking about? The nations of the world are going to gather against Israel. And in fact, there's going to be a climactic battle called Armageddon, when all the armies are coming against the nation of Israel, and there will be a supernatural intervention of God that destroys the armies of the world, and Israel survives and prospers. You can read all about that in any number of prophecy books out there. Certainly they go back to the Bible, which is our root. And what do we know? That at that time, Christians believe that Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, is going to return. That will be his second coming. And at his second coming, he is going to set up a world empire that will last for 1,000 years. By the way, where do you think Hitler got his idea of 1,000-year Reich? You see, Hasatan, the devil, has no original ideas. All he can do is try to warp the truth. And so if he knows that God has said he's going to have 1,000-year reign of peace, then the devil can try to set up 1,000 years of oppression. Obviously, that didn't last anywhere near 1,000 years, not even 100 with Hitler. But when we look at these coming events, we see that Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach, will be coming back. And where is he coming to? You know, for Christians, I say you need to understand your Jewish roots, because Jesus is Jewish. He was, is, and always will be Jewish. If you read it carefully, you'll find that when he comes back, and by the way, he's coming back to Jerusalem, and the law will once again go forth from Zion. It will not be Rome. It will not be New York City or Washington or the Bible Belt. But when Yeshua comes back, it is going to be to Jerusalem. And he's going to reign from Jerusalem for 1,000 years of world peace. At the end of that, history as you and I know it will be concluded. The Bible says the universe will be rolled up like a scroll. I could teach some very interesting things about that analogy when we understand quantum physics. But the universe as we know it will be rolled up, and a brand new universe will be created. But that's beyond the pale of what we are now. Where we are now is we see the nations of the world aligning against Israel. And unfortunately, part of that alignment has now begun to take place with our own government. Ever since 1948, when Harry S. Truman, as president, immediately recognized the nation of Israel, the State Department was against that recognition. The State Department has continued to be anti-Israel, even though secretaries of state would make all kinds of "we support Israel" comments. The truth is that their decision-making apparatus was against the support of Israel. Let me just throw out a point in that for your consideration. The Congress of the United States, as on multiple occasions, instructed that the embassy, U.S. embassy, should be moved to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Every nation gets to decide where its capital is. Nobody can tell us that Washington cannot be our capital. It is our capital. We chose that. No one can tell the British, London isn't your capital. London is their capital. No one can tell the Germans, Berlin cannot be your capital. Bonn cannot be your capital. Bonn is the capital. And so it is that Israel comes along and says Jerusalem is our capital. By the way, that has great historic validity. It was never the capital of any other nation or territory ever, but rather it was the capital of the Israelis, the Israeli people, until the Romans totally destroyed the city, leveled it, and forced the Jews out of the land altogether. But the Congress, therefore, says we ought to move our embassy to Jerusalem and has appropriated the money to do that. And yet administration after administration, both Republican and Democrat, have signed waivers on that move saying, no, we're not going to do it now. No, we're not going to do it now. My question, seeing that both sides of the aisle in the Congress have voted to do it, and yet both parties, when they are the presidents, sign waivers not to do it, is this: who is driving that policy? The policy, obstacles to moving the capital, moving the embassy to the capital in Jerusalem, is clearly coming out of the State Department. And so the State Department, which again opposed acknowledging Israel in 1948, has never ceased doing that. What we have is a U.S. State Department of unelected officials, unelected bureaucrats, that is driving the foreign policy of this country over the will of the people. The people have decreed, the people have declared, the Congress has declared what their intention is, and yet that intention is not being carried out because of one government department of unelected people standing in the way. That's a whole other issue in itself. But I say that to bring to our thinking, and I was talking about it last week and will continue to do so next week, as we focus on the fact that America in its leadership has shifted. What took place several weeks ago in Geneva when the U.S. president said that they were going to have a new way to deal with Iran and allow Iran to continue to process uranium was the most ludicrous thing ever to happen. Many, many national leaders, most of our allies, realize that that is a policy that has made the world a more dangerous place. Interesting this week when I'm doing this recording that some of the things that President Obama said and then later said, well, I didn't say that or I didn't mean it, are being dealt with in the news media, even the national news media. And the question came up about the red line, that President Obama had said, this is a red line. We will not allow Iran to cross this red line. Well, the films are there. The videotapes are there. The sound bites are there. That is exactly what he said. But now what he's saying is, I never said, that was not my idea to define a red line. That's what the press said. But it wasn't the press. You know, they take his clip now, which says, I never said that, and then they show the clip from, yes, in fact, he did say that. So what our president did is to address a nation whose policies are dangerous to the world, that we're defining a red line and you come up to that line, but if you cross that line, we are going to ensure that your nuclear capability is dismantled. But we came to that line and he backed off. What is going on? Well, interesting, even Saudi Arabia, who the State Department would favor as our best friend in the Middle East, the Saudis were all out of sorts because they were not consulted on what the president was going to have done in Geneva. Think of that. These are your major allies, the Saudis, the Israelis, even to a certain extent some of the Europeans, and yet they were not consulted in the policy of the United States. So the United States, as a world leader, with a president who says that, well, I don't want us to dictate to the world, I think we need to be collaborative, and yet when it comes to dealing with Iran, took a dictatorial approach, quite apart from what the United Nations has done, quite apart from all the nations have done. He, in essence, going down this road of sanctions to force Iran to do something without having to go to war with them. When it came to the end, he abandoned all his friends, I should say our friends, abandoned all our friends, abandoned the pressures of the United Nations, abandoned all that, and unilaterally drove a decision to back off the sanctions, to allow them to develop nuclear, and by the way, and now to release funds to them, billions of dollars of funds to them. Something isn't right in Washington. Something is drastically wrong in Washington. And in the midst of doing this, many of the writers from Unity Coalition to some of the leading think tanks are beginning to address the issue that the status of America in the world, because of what happened in Geneva, has shifted dramatically. The first thing is that the world has woken up to the fact that America can make promises but may not keep them. For the first time, the credibility of America is highly suspect. And for many of the world leaders, this is not simply a matter of, well, you know, we have a president and he's doing things wrong, but come the next election, things will change. It is that the American people may at any moment vote a man into the leadership of the country who tears down all that the country is pledged to do. Now, it's interesting when that happens in other parts of the world, we are, as Americans, are quick to criticize it. Let me give you an example. That Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel. And there's been relative peace between Egypt and Israel since that was signed. By the way, Sadat paid with his life for that decision. But all of a sudden, several years back when the Muslim Brotherhood came into power, they're not now, we now have a coup that has taken place, and the Egyptian generals are in charge until they can vote on a constitution. That's coming up pretty quick. But when the Muslim Brotherhood was in charge, all of a sudden people began to say that the treaty between Egypt and Israel was now suspect. It may not be upheld. In other words, the Muslim Brotherhood might say, hey, that was somebody else that signed that treaty. We don't believe in it, and so therefore we're going to dismantle it. We know that's true in the Islamic world. We know from the Oslo Accords that the Yasser Arafat and the Palestinians, doesn't make any difference what they sign. Their signature is valueless. To have them sign, and we agree to this, but they don't put it into practice. And I could spend a whole session on that, but we know for a fact that within Islam theology, that treaties between Muslims and non-believers are never held to be valid. They are signed only for the temporary move that requires you to sign it so you can get to the next stage where ultimately you win the battle. So that we know embedded in Islamic theology that any treaty signed between a Muslim nation and a Gentile nation, that inherent in the people and leaders of that Islamic nation is that the treaty is invalid any day we decide it is. My question is then, what is the value of signing treaties? And so it is that the United States was always one that was pictured as making promises and keeping them. Well, because of Geneva, the nations of the world are drastically moving away from that. Egypt, who, by the way, had a military relationship with the United States, is now looking to Russia, and Russia has agreed to supply them with attack fighter jets, to supply them with the equipment to control riots in their cities. The alliance used to be between Egypt and Russia. It changed to the United States over many, many years, and now it's going to revert back to Russia because of what our president has done in relating to them. Saudi Arabia is beginning to look at different alliances it needs. It is exploring the possibility of how they can have an alliance with, let's say, Pakistan, so they can get nuclear weapons to defend themselves. Against who? Against Iran. We think of them both as Islamic nations, but they hate each other. And Saudi Arabia is now at a point where they realize America has a defense treaty with us, but we cannot count on America coming to our aid. That's shocking when you think somebody said, I'll be there, I've got your back covered, but suddenly you don't have it, you're not willing to do your part. That has now broken between the United States and the Saudis. News reports are letting us know that the Saudis are even working with Israel about how to deal with Iran. That doesn't mean the Saudis are Israel's friends. They too would like to see Israel eliminated, but as a practical matter, they realize that Israel is the only nation who with them might be able to deal with the Iranian problem. So the Saudis more than likely, should Israel decide to attack Iran, give the Saudi Air Force the right to fly over the Israeli Air Force the right to fly over Saudi Arabia in that attack. What is happening with our nation friends in the world is that they have realized that America can no longer be trusted. This has all to do with our connection with Israel and the Middle East. The Bible is very clear that the nation that supports Israel will find itself strengthened. The nation that comes against Israel will find itself divided. I urge you to join me next week as we continue this discussion on Jewish roots.